So sable antelope, and I think everybody was a little bit taken aback by how the market price of these game species increased. So quite recently, this specific bull, and they all have names, this is Charlie, was actually sold on auction for a very large amount of money, sold for 12.2 million. And on that specific auction, the turnover of the auction was almost 90 million rand, and that's for 87 antelope. So there's quite a bit of interest in these species from a game farming perspective. Traditionally, there's 4 recognized subspecies within sable, and what I should perhaps just add here is that following NAMBA, the Biodiversity Law, the Biodiversity Act, you're not allowed to translocate or move species across subspecies boundaries, so that's quite important. 4 subspecies recognized in sable. The first one, the Variani, or the giant sable, everybody thought it was extinct because of the civil unrest in Angola. Then the Niger subspecies, which essentially occurs over the largest part, the one in red here, over the largest part. We've got Kirkia, the one in blue there, and then Roosevelti down the coastal edge. So this is the first paper looking at the genetic diversity within sable antelope. At this point in time, we became involved in the work where a lot of people and movements and sort of conservation agencies and things from South Africa went on a mission to try and find out whether the giant sable in Angola really went extinct. So, for example, wildlife management at the University of Pretoria funded or co-funded and led quite a few of these expeditions into Angola to try and find the giant sable. So at that point in time, they brought hair back, they brought dung samples back, and we tested it in the lab, and it never tested sable. It always tested roan or waterbuck, things like that. So we were never able to really say, yes, there are sable DNA, we're picking up sable DNA in Angola, which would indicate the presence of the antelope there. But then in 2005, they were putting up these camera traps, these infrared camera traps, and at more or less the same time, they brought back some dung pellets, and it actually tested sable, and these infrared cameras also took pictures of sable, and that led to the rediscovery of the giant sable in Angola. At more or less the same time, animals were started flooding into the South African market, which looked remarkably similar to the giant sable. And the one thing to look at is the facial markings. So on the left, you have a picture of the giant sable, very black, but what you can see is that the face is also mostly black. The stripe is continuous along the side of the face. And these are the animals that came in, and at that point, they were selling them on auction as giant sable. And the question then was, but are these really giant sable or not? Phenotypically remarkably similar, but the one thing that put the doubt on it was essentially the length of the horns. If you look at the horn length here in giant sable, it's significantly larger than in the sable that we have here and the sable that actually came in. The genetic information showed that these animals that came in and was almost sort of punted on the market as giant sable were in fact not giant sable. So if you look at the genetics, here's the genetic group which all clustered together for giant sable, and then down here are those animals that came in. And everybody's been trying to figure out where these animals come from, and unfortunately the guy that led the expedition died in a helicopter crash, but of course they weren't really going to say that these are only Western Zambian sable. They come from Western Zambia, not actually from Angola. So just to show you, remember the giant sable is here, only occurring in a small area in Angola, and those Western Zambian sable essentially come from an area there which is right on the border. So what is the future then of the giant sable? Well, without direct intervention and considerable effort, probably not very good. Very low numbers, and I'll talk a little bit about those now, as well as hybridization with roan. But what is quite interesting is that even in 1916, when the giant sable was initially described as a separate subspecies, they already alluded to the fact that these specific antelopes would need special conservation. Giant sable occur only in these two small areas in Angola. The first is the Kangandala National Park. In the 1970s, there were about 5 herds comprising 150 animals, and in 2009, only 20 animals left. There's no mature bull at that point with a herd, which meant that a roan bull actually came in and took over the sable herd. So that whole population now are hybrids between roan and sable, and there are considerable efforts ongoing at the moment to try and localize those pure giant sable separate from the hybrids. The Luandu Integral National Reserve is much larger, but it's also unfortunately much more inaccessible. So we never knew whether there were giant sable in that second part. We knew that traditionally it occurred there, but nobody could ever find it. And quite interesting, what they actually did was they had a Judas animal, which they collared. So they took a sable from the other population, collared it, left it in the reserve, and then followed the collar. And of course, the sable bull, this Judas bull, found the other animals. So not 100% sure how many animals there are, but I would think today in total, no more than 50 pure giant sable left. The latest here is essentially where, as part of this large collaboration with Portuguese and also researchers in Angola, we've added the nuclear data. So allow me just a second to explain the difference between your mitochondrial DNA, which is almost like our surnames. It stays pure per generation. So the mother transmits her mitochondrial DNA to the offspring and it never changes, to the nuclear DNA, which actually shows you the mother and the father's contributions. So this is where you can actually see how much variation there really are in populations. So we've just published in 2015 the microsatellite loci for the sable. If you then run a structure analysis, which essentially just groups individuals together based on genetic similarity, and you can simulate those runs for 2, for 3, for 4, for 5 different populations, trying to work out how many distinct groups there are. It turns out that there are in fact 4 groups within Sable, which very much corresponds to what we knew from the mitochondrial DNA as well, and that these groups are essentially pure. Let me just explain this. Every bar or line running down is essentially an individual. So if we look here, for example, we can see that this specific individual has purple, a little bit of blue, a little bit of orange, a little bit of green. So this individual is quite mixed because its DNA has membership to a lot of the different groups. Whereas the natural situation here, you can see that the groups are essentially quite pure. So these are animals south of the Zambezi River. Here's your giant sable in Angola, relatively pure. Here's your Zambian group, and then here's a group within Tanzania, in other words, on the other side of the rift. What we did, and this is a little bit shocking, but to be expected as well, is that we ran the structure analysis, the nuclear DNA for sable antelope on South African game farms. Remember, the natural situation is that they are quite pure, and if you look here, there's almost no pure sable individuals. So all the members on game farms, all the sable antelope on game farms, are essentially mixed. They hybridized. They are, the result of crossing between these different groups.
The University of Johannesburg. Rethink, reinvent.